welcome. So as I was saying, this is going to be quite Scandinavian dominated, isn't it, in terms of the attendees and the papers, but so that's wonderful. So we've got, on the subject of change management, we've got 3 really interesting papers. The first one towards a leadership model for managing social change in maintenance networks. So Koos will be answering to that paper. The second one, the role of key actors in the emergence of strategic innovation programs, so a translation process perspective. And Mattias is here to answer to that paper. And then thirdly, unpacking the black box of digitalization. So we've got Henrik here answering to that paper, and probably Olof as well. All right, so we will run with the pattern of presenting the paper and then stop for the questions, presenting the paper and stopping for the questions. All right. Got any questions or queries or problems, then please put them in the chat. And let's hope we don't get too much of an echo on these presentations. So here we go with the first presentation.
Welcome to this presentation. My name is Koos Johannes, and I prepared this paper with the people whose names you can see on the slide. The topic of this presentation is client leadership in construction. There are 2 key points that I want to make in this presentation. First one is that managerial interventions in social relations are critical in developing client leadership. Second one is that stewardship theory can be useful in analyzing leadership when combined with concepts from entrepreneurship. And I will now make an argument for both statements. In this study, we specifically looked at the role of the owner, because the owner is in a position to establish project transcending leadership. We have been able to study an extreme case, extreme in the sense that it was an exceptionally good example of construction client leadership, evidenced by international awards and independent researcher reports. More details on case selection are discussed in the paper. We collected data through 20 retrospective interviews with respondents from various parts of this maintenance network, which is on the slide, and we were able to make some observations in meetings. We identified 3 events that were viewed by respondents as critical for client leadership because they challenged existing social conventions in parts of the network. When a construction client wants to get activities done in a way that is different from what project managers, contractors, or suppliers are used to do for other clients, they must engage with professionals and they must change or modify social conventions of various communities of practice. And this is where leadership comes into play. We looked for a leadership theory that addressed the human relation and soft skill elements that were reflected in our case data, and that could describe how managers can engage with professionals to change social conventions. And because several respondents, independently from each other, literally talked about ownership, we came up with this leadership model based on stewardship theory, in which psychological ownership is a central concept. To illustrate the model, I will use one of the critical events that is described in the paper. It is the event that, at some moment in time, mechanics were required to start working with a newly developed data capturing tool that challenged their perception of what it meant to be a maintenance mechanic. Because the construction client wanted accurate field data on their assets, mechanics in the field got administrative tasks in capturing and registering asset data in a format provided by the construction client. Until then, they did not like to see themselves as data capturing officers, but as traditional mechanics. And in that situation, the contractor's product manager recognized that something extra was necessary to get the mechanics used to working with the tool, he demonstrated psychological ownership by subordinating his individual interests to the interests of the construction client. His individual interests would have been to just deliver the software tool with the manual and get on with his work for other clients. But because he psychologically felt owner of the long-term interests of the construction client, he made a series of interventions with the mechanics that were specific in the sense that they were targeted to a specific part of the network, in this instance, the maintenance subcontractors, and on a specific level, in this case, the personal level of the individual mechanics. In the model, these interventions are viewed as stewardship behavior because the product manager's interventions were not described in documents, but were inspired by his psychological ownership of the long-term ambitions of the client. The reason why the contractor's product manager demonstrated psychological ownership in this case can for a part be traced back to two kinds of support that were provided by the construction client's asset manager. First, through a contract reduction program, he provided what in the model is called contextual support about the client's long-term objectives and asset management strategies. This influenced the cognitive mechanisms of the product manager in the sense that it changed his mind into one that was more concerned with the long-term objectives of the client. Second, the construction client's asset manager provided relational support to the product manager through his engagement in frequent formal and informal meetings and social exchanges in which he showed some level of concern and understanding for the product manager. This influenced the effective mechanisms of the product manager in the sense that it generated trust in the client's asset manager as a person. In the same way as I just described for one of the critical events, the data on the other critical events could also be linked to the model. However, the relation between the psychological ownership and managerial intervention could use some additional clarification. And based on a quick scan of some entrepreneurship literature, it is suggested that the theoretical relation between psychological ownership and managerial interventions might be understood in more depth when interventions are viewed as a deed of social entrepreneurship. And that brings me to our conclusions. Summarizing our findings, we have three conclusions. First, our data from an extreme case suggest that to establish project transcending client leadership, interventions in social relations are required in various parts of the maintenance network. Second, it seems that in the model, contextual and relational leader support can be linked to respectively the cognitive and affective mechanisms of followers. Third, our study gives reason to believe that stewardship behavior can be described through structural and psychological factors, but it also seems that concepts from entrepreneurship play a role. In terms of limitations of this study, it should be mentioned that we did not have the opportunity to analyze in great detail the structural factors of the model and the contractual arrangements between suppliers and contractors. Further data analysis and research is required into the influence of structural factors in intra- and inter-organizational relations, because the control and reward systems are different across different organizations. Other research should be aimed at understanding how opportunity recognizing and entrepreneurial personality traits fit into the model. Finally, we want to argue that stewardship theory deserves a place in the world of construction management. Compared to agency theory, for example, and transaction cost economics, it may have its limitations in explaining market-driven phenomena, but it can explain the role of human relations in socio-technical phenomena, and that could become increasingly important in the future of construction management. This brings me to the end of this presentation. I hope you enjoyed watching it. Please take a look at our paper if you want to have more information about the case or when you want to read more on this topic. Thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to meeting you in the online Q&A session.
Thanks very much, Koos. Very good indeed. A very interesting paper. So, do we have a question? Any questions, please? Okay, so let me just kick off with a question which relates to the future of the work you're doing. You've talked about this enterprise personality trait element, or was it entrepreneurship? Wasn't it entrepreneurship? How do you see that fitting into the model that you're building in respect to stewardship?
Yeah, that's thank you. It's a good question. In the meantime, I have been able to explore a little bit more the literature on entrepreneurship, well, in the paper I'm talking about social entrepreneurship. It seems that it is more related to entrepreneurial behavior, and entrepreneurial behavior can also be witnessed beyond entrepreneurship. There's a difference between entrepreneurship and intrapreneurship. So here we are looking more towards entrepreneurial behavior in a corporate setting. Of course, we are not talking about people who are starting their own business. And from, as you could see on the slides, my first review of the literature pointed towards the idea of opportunity recognizing. But in the meantime, when reviewing the literature a little bit more, it seems that in the literature on human behavior and entrepreneurship, the concept of self-efficacy is very crucial in entrepreneurship. So I think I have to elaborate a little bit more on that, but I think self-efficacy could be the missing link that links psychological ownership in terms of a state of mind towards intervention, which is a concrete step of a course of action. So it could well be that it is related to self-efficacy. And one thing that I would like to investigate also a little bit more is in what way leadership support is associated or can lead to increased levels of self-efficacy. And I've read some papers on it, but they are a little bit, I have to look into a little bit more detail. Some papers, researchers say that's, coaching doesn't have a lot of impact on self-efficacy, but other papers say the opposite. So I have to explore a little bit more on that point. I hope I answered your question. Yeah?
Yes, you have indeed. Thank you very much. Right. Do we have another question, please? Will, what do you think? You're muted.
Yeah, you sound almost muted as well. Your microphone is so quiet.
My microphone is?
Yes, I can hardly hear you.
Oh gosh, sorry. Let's go to headphones then.
Oh, that's much better. Yes, apologies. Chris asked me to pop into here to help out with the session after Koos's paper was nearly finished.
Yes. Okay.
Questions.
Is that better from me now? Is that
yes,
clear?
Yeah, you're much more clear now.
Someone should have said. Sorry. Yes. Okay, so do we have another question? No? All right. Well, thanks so much, Koos, for that. And best of luck with the continuation of the work.
Thank
All
you very
right.
much.
Good. All right, let's move on to paper 2 then. So the role of key actors in the emergence of a strategic innovative program, a translation process perspective. So we'll run the presentation, and then hopefully we'll get some questions to support what you've been saying.
Hi, my name is Olof Håkansson. I'm a PhD student at the School of Engineering at Jacobsson University. I will present the paper, The Role of Key Actors in the Emergence of a Strategic Innovation Program, a Translation Process Perspective. I have written this paper together with two of my supervisors, Professor Henrik Linderoth and Associate Professor Mattias Jacobsson. The ability to innovate and adapt to change is of central importance at almost all levels of society today. During the last decade, so-called strategic innovation programs, SIPs, have emerged as a way to facilitate system-wide innovation and change, where the underlying idea of a SIP is that research, innovation and development should be developed in collaborative and actor-driven network involving industry, public sector and academia, where the mobilization of involved actors and their ability to cooperate in new constellations is key to the success of these programs. However, the actors involved in the SIP is often represented by different organizations that are heterogeneous in the sense that they have different goals, they represent different organizing logics, and they are active in different parts of an industry's value chain. While existing research on innovation programs focus on internally driven innovation within large corporations, research on strategic innovation programs as actor-driven networks that target system-wide change are less common. Therefore, the purpose of this study is to analyze and describe how a strategic innovation program is established and what role key actors play in this process. Empirically, the study is situated in the Swedish construction industry, where a SIP has been established with the objective to facilitate the need of structural changes in the way that the industry operates. And a particular focus is on how to use digitalization and digital transformation to support this industry-wide change. Theoretically, the study draws inspiration from actor network theory, the translation process, and more specifically, Calonne's work on the 4 moments of translation. That has facilitated the analysis and the events that led to the development of the SIP, and it has helped to structure the results. This is not always a linear process, as the figure below indicates, but each moment deals with a certain issue. We have the moment of problematizations, or how actors can become indispensable, the moment of entrustment, or how allies are isolated and locked into place, the moment of enrollment, or the way which roles are defined and coordinated, and finally the moment of mobilization of allies, which regards whether the spokespersons are seen as representatives for their respective actor groups. We have the perspective of the focal actor, or the perspective of the initiators of this program, with an explanatory and a retrospective approach since the events that led to the development of this SIP goes back to 2012. We've done 11 semi-structured interviews with individuals that are deeply involved in the establishment of the SIP, and we have used a thematic analysis where the terminology and concepts related to the 4 moments of translations were used to analyze and describe how the network of actors were formed. If we then take a look at the result and starts with the moment of problematization, the underlying problem that the SIP set out to address was the performance problems of the construction industry. Here, the initiators of the SIP argue that it is extremely hard for an individual actor to engage or achieve change that has impact further away in the value chain. This challenge is due to an inertia or slowness in the construction production system, rather than the single actor's resistance to change, which sometimes is the reputation of the industry. And the solution to the performance problems and the challenge for individual actors or companies to engage in change, it often lies in between or sometimes above the traditional roles, processes and responsibilities of an individual organization or construction project. 3 categories of actors were identified as relevant and or needed to address these problems. And this is the actors of change, which are the companies or organizations like municipalities, contractors, facility managers that either want to change or have influence over large parts of the construction process. We have the academia, which is universities and research institutes, and also the funding agencies that here is represented by 3 research councils that funds these types of initiatives. And with the problem and the identified actors in mind, the idea that emerged with this SIP was to create an opportunity for the actors to collaborate outside traditional roles, processes and responsibilities of construction activities, and be able to engage in or influence other parts of the industry's value chain. Moving on to the moment of entrustment, or how the allies are isolated and locked into place. While the performance problems was relevant and recognizable for many of the identified actors, a solution in terms of a SIP was a bit hard to understand for the involved actors. For example, roles and relationship between the involved actors were hard to understand. It was seen as a way to outcompete existing initiatives, like interest organizations and other R&D funding options. And actually, both academia and actors of change, they did not really see the need to collaborate more or in new ways. So, as a way to strengthen the actors' interest in the SIP, the use of collaborative R&D projects were introduced by the initiators. These collaborative and R&D projects creates an opportunity where both industrial actors and academia can start to collaborate in new ways outside traditional construction activities, and at the same time get these activities funded through the SIP. The moment of enrollment is about the way in which roles are defined and coordinated. In our case, the development of the SIP depends on the engagement of the identified actors. And while the initiators can advocate and impose the importance of the SIP, in the end, it is up to the identified actors, the municipalities, contractors, facility managers, etc., that needs to accept the new role and relationships in this new network. However, in 2014, the enrollment of the funding agencies failed, who denied the SIP its funding. This was partly due to the lack of key actors that supported the SIP, since the actors or companies did not really understand their part in this, but also since the scope was too extensive. Trying to change the entire industry was a bit hard to understand. So, modifications were needed all the way from problematizations to enrollment, and a second cycle of translation was needed, which led to the enrollment of the funding agency and approval of the SIP in late 2015 or in the beginning of 2016. The moment, or the mobilization of allies, is about the spokesperson's trustworthiness and how representatives for the actor or the company that they represent, how representative they are for this actor. And the first time, only a few individuals were enrolled, and they did not really have the possibility to speak for the companies that they represented. However, in the second time, CEOs from some of the largest companies or organizations in the industry showed their support and willingness to participate and engage in this SIP. So, by using the translation process as an analytical frame, it can be concluded that the immediate role of key actors in the emergence of a SIP is to represent a stable network of heterogeneous actors for the funding agency to approve and fund the SIP. The first cycle of translation failed, even if the problem that the SIP set out to solve was relevant for the identified actors. The actors felt more aligned with existing roles and industry initiatives for R&D projects, and was therefore a bit hesitant regarding the proposed SIP, which in previous studies has been described as a moment of wait and see or a reactive stance towards change in the industry. The second cycle of translation, the long-term goal of structurally changing the industry, changed to a more short-term goal and tangible goal of strengthening the industrial actors' digital competencies. Here, it is possible to argue that this solution is more recognizable to the involved actors, since the actors in the construction industry tend to look more on short-term benefits than long-term goal. However, the idea of a SIP is still to facilitate both system and industry-wide changes. Future studies need to focus on how to go from existing and short-term focus of strengthening the industrial actors' digital competencies and how this can be used to structurally change on industry level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Right.
Well, I made a question to get us going, Alex.
You go, Will. Go on then first. Yep.
I'm always interested in actor network theory, Olof, and I don't claim any expertise in it though. I'm an interested observer of ANT. But one of the things that I've noticed is that one would usually mobilize ANT to deal with both human and non-human actors and look at the network. But it was interesting that in your identification of 3 categories of actors, professional institutions, for example, are missing, and more marked from my point of view, there's no non-human actors. So since you're only dealing with human actors, it made me wonder why you chose ANT as a theoretical underpinning for the research. Oh, you're muted. Let me see if I can fix that. How about that? No, still not.
You're unmuted now, Olof. It should be. Oh, it's gone back to muted again. Try now. No, it's gone back again.
It shows us unmuted.
Yes.
Can you hear me from here?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Then Olof is coming here, and so we share my computer.
So, then you will see me now also. Thank you for that question, Will. Good question. One of the main things with this strategic innovation program that has been developed here in the Swedish construction industry is that they try to use both industrialization and digitalization as some kind of driving forces for this. In this paper, we did not include the digitalization as an actor because there was not room for it. Actually, the paper that will come next will try to describe the presentation we have hereafter, the role of digitalization and how they try to inscribe behavior and such with digitalization for the different R&D projects. So there was the simple answer to that question is that in this paper there was not room, but it is included in the process. And the reason for why I chose to use actor network theory and the translation process trying to understand this is that digitalization is the underlining idea for development that should happen here.
I see. So how did power play into that, the concept of power?
You mean power of digitalization?
The power, differential power of the different actors. For example, when often in strategic innovation programs, somebody in power decides that, in this case, an industry is going to modernize. But they only think they're in power. They don't actually hold any of the resources. All the resources are in the hands of contractors, let's say, or design consultancies. So there are different kinds of power at play here. And I've always thought that power is quite an interesting variable to help us understand what's going on in an area.
I think I understand the question, and I would try to answer it because the initiators of the strategic innovation program, they had the ambition that they would like to how did we say, transform the construction industry by means of digitalization and industrialization. While they don't have the power, they are not the process owner of this. And I think once again we will see this a bit in the next presentation, that they try to hand over the responsibility of using digitalization to transform to the collaborative R&D project, which we talk about here, so that it's actually the actors and the actors of change and the academia that are supposed to collaborate with digitalization and some kind of meeting ground to develop new solution that would work throughout the value chain. So maybe that the power relationship goes from the initiators of the SIP, but since they're not the process owner, and actually it's publicly funded, all of this, so they can't even decide exactly which project should get funding, and so that's actually a closed committee with different preferences. They should decide.
Yeah, I also, as you said, the power is, I think, where it's also visible here, because as Olof said in the presentation, so they was not granted the money from the beginning because they don't have the, so to say, support with this funding agency, or didn't recognize the support from the industry. So here we see, then we see, so to say, the power of the CEOs when they, so to say, signing or saying that, okay, we are committed to this initiative. Then, I mean, that is one component that, so to say, convince the founders to grant the money or to approve this SIP. So there you have, I mean, you can see a dimension of the or who has the power in this case or in this process. To getting, so to say, taking the last step.
I think one small point about the presentations of this kind is that there's a danger of using too many abstract terms. So when you talk about the initiators, I understand in principle what you mean, but who is it? Who initiated it? Which organization or group?
The initiators here are actually, well, they could be represented by 5 individuals, but leaving them out, there was a call for research and innovation agendas in Sweden 8-9 years ago, and one agenda focused on BIM, one focused on industrialization, and one focused on geographical information system. The initiators are the people who were involved in writing these agendas, because these agendas was then later what was developed to Smart Built Environment, which is the strategic innovation program.
Understand.
And these initiators, there are also people who have been around in the industry for not decades. Some of them been around for decades. So I mean, they were well-known figures, so to say.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting. Yeah.
And just a sort of bit more of a naive question from me in terms of, why did the first round fail then? Is this, do you feel as though you've got to the bottom of that in understanding why in 2015, the network didn't work?
Of course, it's not the only answer to this question, but one of the main things was that they did not, the initiators did not manage to enroll enough key actors. Those people, those individuals that were involved, they were maybe what you can call champions. They were really interested, and they had an interest in these kind of questions of how to use digitalization and BIM to transform the industry. But what the funding agency did not see is that the large actors, like the large contractors, the large subcontractors, municipalities, some agencies that were needed, they were not belong here. So this will not work if it's only individuals who are engaged. It needs to be companies, representatives from companies that stand behind an initiative like this.
Yeah, fair enough.
But one of the biggest stories about industrialization, certainly recently, was that Catera in the USA, famously bombing and going bankrupt a couple of months ago. And it was very interesting that the promise of industrialization was being carried by a firm like Katera in the USA. And there's a lot of companies here that are very interested in progressing industrialization. But what they're doing doesn't seem very different from what we've seen in the past. And funnily enough, I found a PhD recently from 1957 at the University of Edinburgh about the problems of modern methods of construction and the industrialization of the building process. So clearly we've been experimenting with industrialization for about 70 years now. And it makes me wonder why people like these initiators and the British government, amongst others, seem to think that suddenly industrialization of the building process would be a useful answer, because it never has done in the past. It just keeps failing.
Can I ask a question?
Indeed, yes, please. Yeah.
Olof, you in your presentation, you end with a conclusion, and you are paying attention to the stability of the network. You say very explicitly there has to be a stable network. How does that relate to? It seems a little bit in contrast with innovation, which is also dynamic and which maybe requires new actors to engage and get introduced in something. Some innovations are disruptive because new actors are coming along who don't have an history. So what do you mean with stability in terms of? Could you clarify that?
Yeah. The point with a stable network, as one of the first bullet points at the conclusion slide, was the role of key actors. That the key actors, they are not actually only individuals. They are CEO, they are representatives for some of the largest companies. And that is the stable network that the funding agency needed to be able to approve and grant them funding to be able to do this.
Basically, I think what we are asking for this disruption, that is something that is going to happen after they have, so to say, granted finances to this strategic innovation program.
You know, one of the comments of one of the other people just remembered me about you said, well, it seems that nothing has changed maybe a lot in terms of the research questions and in terms of digitalization or industrialization. In one of my former jobs, I got we also in the Netherlands did some study about robotics in construction industry, and it was in the 80s. It was 30 years ago, I think, and there was a study, and at that time in Japan. Maybe some of you are more familiar with that, but Japan in that time was very famous because of their robotics in industry. And some research and development manager of a big Netherlands construction company said, well, it also has to do with market size. In the Netherlands, we are only a small country, but to get a return on the big investments that are required to build a factory for robotics building houses, the machines are there, but in Japan they use them for high-rise buildings, kind of robots. Now, of course, now it's different, but it's also, maybe it also is a question of the market will have to be big enough to make those investments that are associated with it. So maybe in China now, I don't know what.
Well, it's not just to do with market size. I mean, it's a very good point, but. I spent quite a lot of time looking at the Japanese construction sector. And one of the interesting things about housing in Japan is that it's not really socially impressive, let's say, to have a second-hand house. So whereas in the UK, the housing market is predominantly older houses, second-hand houses. And there's a small part of the market is new houses. We have about 200,000 new dwellings per year. Whereas in Japan, there's no market for second-hand houses, or very little. And so the whole culture of housing, they've commodified housing. And when robotics and industrialization was really big in Japan a couple of decades ago, the biggest builder of apartments was Toyota. And that really reminded me of just how different the market is, because in Northwest Europe, we wouldn't be interested in mass-produced apartments that were as similar to each other as cars are. And so it's not just the size, is what I'm saying. There's some, and this is why I'm interested in actor network theory, because there's a chance that it could tease out some more of those different variables that we do not usually look at. Normally, when people are looking at change in the construction sector, they tend to only look at the same actors: the contractors, the designers, the clients, and maybe the government. But they don't look at things like, I don't know, the economy, how the economy actually works, and how it differs from how it used to work, and how it differs from economies in other countries. So the economics of construction have a huge impact on what can be achieved and what can't be achieved, which is why I'm interested in a broader category of actors, I think. So I think ANT holds out a great deal of interest for all of us, a lot of hope to bring new insights into these processes, to help us open our eyes beyond the normal boundaries of research projects.
Great. Thanks, Will. And we'll have to finish the discussion there. So moving on to the third presentation then.
Thank you very much for the questions and the interesting insights and discussion.
Pleasure.
Thanks very much. So unpacking the black box of digitization. Let's
Hi, my name is Henrik Linderoth, Professor in Construction and Informatics, and I have co-authored this paper together with my colleagues Olof Håkansson, who is PhD student, and Annika Moscati, who is Assistant Professor at the School of Engineering in Jönköping, Sweden. And the title of the paper is Unpacking the Black Box of Digitalization, Challenges when Implementing Governmental Initiatives. If we're looking at the points of departure for our paper, so we know that governmental initiatives has been a means for trying to improve the performance of the construction industry. And one of the latest trends here is so-called strategic innovation programs, where collaboration among private and public organizations and academia should, so to say, facilitate the performance or improve the performance of the construction industry. And at the same time, we also know that digitalization has been seen as a kind of savior for the construction industry, that it should help the industry with all its problem. So basically, we will have a focus on digitalization and strategic innovation programs in this paper. But what we also know that is the outcomes of digitalization, at least when we see from policy levels, seems to be taken for granted or also black box. But we also know that original ideas and intention with digitalization initiatives, they drift away from these ideas and intentions, so to say. So the purpose of the paper is to describe and analyze how a strategic innovation program's ideas and intention moves from its initiators to realization in collaborative R&D project. So we have drawn on our inspiration from actor network theory by using the concepts of black box, intermediator, and mediator. So if we look at first the concept of black box, it is or saying that a black box contains which no longer needs to be reconsidered, those things whose content have become a matter of indifference. So for example, the issue of which, or if we should use computers in the construction project, that is nothing that is discussed anymore. So we can say that issue or question is black box. Then we have the second concept of intermediator, which is what transport meaning or force without transformation, and saying defining its input is enough to define its outputs. So intermediator can also be seen as a black box, but also saying that this contains smaller black boxes. So we can, for example, say that digitalization outputs. So intermediator can also be seen as a black box, but also saying that this contains smaller black boxes. So we can, for example, say that digitalization will transform the industry. So digitalization is seen as a kind of intermediator, but if we start on kind of black box, but then how it should be done, that's outputs. So intermediator can also be seen as a black box, but also saying that this contains smaller black boxes. So we can, for example, say that digitalization will transform the industry. So digitalization is seen as a kind of intermediator, but if we start on kind of black box outputs. So intermediator can also be seen as a black box, but also saying that this contains smaller black boxes. So we can, for example, say that digitalization will transform the industry. So digitalization is seen as a kind of intermediator, but if we start on kind of black box, but then how it should be done, that, so to say, is packed into.
It has just stopped for me. I guess it's just stopped for everybody else as well. I'm trying to turn it on and off. No success yet.
Something that transform, translate, distort,
it's going again.
And modify the meaning of the element they are supposed to carry. So we can say that if digitalization, when it's seen as a means for transformation, that is a kind of mediator, because there we know it's a very complex process. So if we look at the method and approach, so we study is situated in the Swedish construction industry, where we have a strategic innovation program which objective is to facilitate the need for structural changes, and we have a focus on the use of digital technology or digital transformation to support these industry-wide changes. The data collection was done by 11 semi-structured interviews with persons involved in establishing the SIP and also managing the SIP, and we have secondary data from interviews with 20 managers for these collaborative R&D projects. So if we see in some of the results here, and we're starting with the original ideas of this SIP. So basically the original goal or vision was to facilitate structural changes in the way construction industry operates. And this should be done by these, the creation of this collaborative platform or the strategic innovation program. And another original idea or assumption was that actors want to change, but there was inertia in the system that, so to say, hold them back, and they can't drive changes by them own, and they need to cooperate, so to say. But this idea was a little bit too ambitious, because the funding agency that should fund this program said the scope is too big, and the application was rejected. And then one of the initiators said, is it reasonable at this kind of strategic program to change the industry? So they also realized that the scope was a bit too big. So there was a new application, and they modified the goal and said that instead they want to show good examples among partner companies that should affect the industry. And these, so to say, good examples should be accomplished in collaborative R&D projects. And then in the long run, they wanted to achieve an industry-wide transformation. So here we can also see that digitalization is from the beginning seen as a kind of mediator, where we have the structural changes should occur by means of collaboration and digitalization. but then the funding agency sees for a short moment then the strategic innovation program or digitalization as a mediator. So to say, the scope is too big and it's too complex, these projects, so they can't achieve this transformation. So what happening here instead, when the responsibility is delegated to the R&D project, so digitalization becomes an intermediator again. So here they say, okay, that should happen out in the R&D projects. So we still see digitalization as a kind of intermediator. But then what is happening when digitalization coming out in this project? So we should unpack the black box. So it should happen in the collaborative research project. They become, so to say, responsible for initiating the transformation. But what is happening then is that the project managers, they stated that these projects, they increase to an increased understanding of where the problems are. So basically, they discovered the same problems as the initiator. So we can say that this inertia was revisited. And also some project managers stated that it was outside the scope of the project to implement initial support, both from the funding agency and the other actors, so to say. So they know that they say in other industries we have had these transformations, so it should be possible also in initial support, both from the funding agency and the other actors, so to say. So they know that they say in other industries we have had these.
The presentation has stopped for me again.
In the construction industry, but
I think we just need to wait for it to catch up with itself or to restart itself.
There is not much discussion about that. So in that way, digitalization is black box and how it should happen. But what is happening when we need to open the black box and start to, so to say, implement or see how we should do these changes? So what actually happened here, so we can see this unpacking of the black box as an occasion for learning. So initial support, both from the funding agency and the other actors, so to say. So they know that they say in other industries we have had these transformations, so it should be possible also in the construction industry, but how it should be done, there is not much discussion about that. So in that way, digitalization is black box and how it should happen. But what is happening when we need to open the black box and start to, so to say, implement or see how we should do these changes? So what actually happened here, so we can see this unpacking of the black box as an occasion for learning. So the strategic innovation program, we can say that it moves from a mean for structural change to a mean for discovering challenges caused by the inertia. So basically, we haven't moved so fast forward here with this transformation. And what we also can see that we had a lack of preparedness for challenges and complexities of the project. And here we can be a little bit critical if we're looking at the academia, because this knowledge exists in academia, or maybe more correct to say that it exists on islands in the academia. So here we have another challenge, that how do we get this knowledge from these islands in the academia out to this collaborative R&D project that should initiate these structural changes. So I thank you for listening.
Okay, the presentation has now ended for me. Yes.
Yeah.
All right, we got through it. Thanks very much. Okay, so we've got 5 minutes for questions. So could I just kick off with a fairly straightforward question in terms of, you've talked about the black box, and you started off by defining the black box as being understood, accepted, taken without question in terms of digitization. But then you started talking about unpacking the black box. So what's the driver for the unpacking when you felt that the box was packed?
It's basically, if we look at the process from the beginning, so so to say, they see that the digitalization is, so to say, one mean for solving these problems that there are in the construction industry, and they referring also to other industries that it has led to transformation, so to say. But so that is in some way, it is given that digitalization will solve the problems, but they are not problematizing so very much about what should happen and the complexity of the process. So basically, when they start working in these research and development projects, then they discover that this is much more complex than they thought, and they, so to say, discover a lot of these problems that actually this SIP should solve, that is between the different actors. So one quote from the interview saying that, yeah, we need to get the organization in place, so to say, in order to implement these changes. So they go, so to say, when they're unpacking or the complexity of digitalization, it explodes in their faces, so to say, when they start or when they, so to say, have to open a black box and say, okay, but how do we initiate these changes? So,
okay. So it's the hidden detail that's the challenge in a way. Yes. Okay.
I do think it's interesting. It is interesting how people say digitalization is the solution to the problem, without actually explaining what the problem is, which I think is what you just said, Henrik, in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because I've heard a lot of influential people and so forth, governments and all sorts of high-level industry reports, telling us that digitalization will solve our problems, but they don't identify the problems that it is going to solve. Did you find that?
Yes, I mean, now we have just starting to look at, so to say, that since in these projects they should try to solve some kind of problem, or basically it's about this with quality problems, bad performance, and so on in the industry, and then you have lots of different small projects. So basically what is happening here, or what we have seen now, is that you work with small bits and pieces, and the initiators, when they're talking about that the problem is, so to say, laying between the actors, so they have not really tried to work with these problems.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very familiar with this idea that the construction industry performs badly.
Yeah.
And quite often, this is the rhetoric that comes from clients and consultants. It rarely comes from people who actually do construction. The people who make the buildings are usually 3 or 4 or 5 tiers down the supply chain. And their voice is not heard in this debate about problems of performance. And in fact, if clients, what I have often found is when clients are complaining about performance, they're also changing their minds about what they want in the middle of the project. Governments are very good at this, complaining about the delays to the building of a tunnel, and yet they keep changing the specification. And it never dawns on them that they are the cause of the problems. And they don't want themselves to be identified as the cause of the problem. So they need digitalization to be able to transfer the blame for the problem onto the supply side, who have no voice. It's very interesting that this is a continuous theme, that the construction industry performs really badly. But it's a very one-sided claim. Even in our contracts, there's a contractual clause that says the contractor is not allowed to talk in public about the project, but there's no such restriction on the client. So I'm skeptical.
I agree with what Will says, because I feel exactly the same. There's a lot. I also worked in the industry for quite some time, and there's a lot of bad how you say it, because they are compared with the car industry. It's very easy to say that the construction industry is a poor industry, but I think there are a lot of bad clients who don't know how to manage and govern their construction supply chain. So that's one of the reasons that's why I was interested in how the clients should take the blame for it, for a part of it, for themselves. So they have to make up their minds and get in their role and make decisions and show leadership and not put the blame on the supply chain, I think.
No, I can just add that we had another project, and that's exactly what you're describing there. So when we're interviewing contractors and the subcontractors and so on, so that they also talk about, how unprofessional the clients are sometimes. But another thing I want to add that we have been written a little bit in some other papers when you're talking about the performance problem. But when I have looked into these big contractors in Sweden and started looking at the return on equity, and then you see in Sweden they say, okay, 20% is fine. And then I compare with other consultancy firm with facility management firms. So basically they have a similar, even if the profit margins are lousy, so the return on equity, which is one part the stock market are looking at, there they are performing equally. So they still, so to say, making money, so the investors are satisfied. So that is also something that we have started to discuss, that you really don't have a pressure from the investor side, because they get the dividends and they get the 20% of return on equity, so they are happy. But now we go outside the scope of the paper.
Yes.
But I think in terms of your scope, there's a lot of people who have a vested interest in things remaining the same.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. And trying to tease that out from your networks would be very interesting.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right, we're going to have to leave it there. We've had our hour. So thanks very much, presenters. Thanks very much, contributors and attendees.